Hello everyone and welcome to this Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris and today we're talking about noticing. So although the title of this presentation on screen is Noticing in ELT, I'd like to begin by just explaining a little bit to you about what I mean here and what we're going to be looking at. So the subtitle for today is Noticing, what it is, how it can promote language development, and then finally, how to work with it. And I think this is an area that a lot of people perhaps are less familiar with, but perhaps should have an understanding of in order to make informed decisions in their teaching. My name is Neil Harris. I'm a teacher trainer at CELT Cardiff. We're a small boutique language school specialising increasingly in teacher training. It's an area I've been involved in for over 20 years now. So in terms of our agenda, these are the topics that I'm going to be covering. I think inevitably when we're talking about how people learn, we need to spend a little bit of time thinking about what I've called the mystery of language learning. I then want to drill down to looking at noticing as one of a number of ways in which we believe language learning takes place. And then I'll come up with some suggestions for ways in which noticing can be used by teachers and their learners inside and outside the classroom before finishing with some conclusions to wrap up the masterclass. So let's begin then with this whole point about the mystery of language learning. So I thought we'd begin with a quiz. Two really famous people on screen here for you, nothing to do with language teaching and ELT at all. And I wondered if you can name them. So I'll just give you a few seconds if you wanted to pop some ideas into chat. And congratulations if you correctly identified the man as Arsene Wenger, the football manager, and the lady as Kristin Scott Thomas, the famous actress. And as you can see in their little biodata underneath their names, they share something in common. And what is it? Well, it's the fact that they are hugely successful bilinguals. Kristin has acted professionally, both in French and in English. She learnt French, not as a bilingual child, but actually by going to France in her teens and then living there. Whereas Arsene Wenger, again, as an adult, has learnt a number of languages, which really does raise the question, doesn't it? How did they do this? What explains their success and what explains the similar lack of success that many of our students, and perhaps many of us as teachers, have experienced? Well, of course, there is no easy answer to this. Language learning does remain in many ways a bit of a mystery. But what I'm hoping I'm going to be able to do here today is give you some insights into that mystery and our increasing understanding of how it may work. So if you grew up in the UK in the 1970s, this plasticine figure on screen will be immediately recognizable to you. This is Tony Hart's Morph. He was a television personality in his own right, and interestingly came from the same stable, came from the same background as Wallace and Gromit in the famous Aardman animations. What was interesting about Morph is not only his name, which obviously brings to mind words like morphine in language studies, but also the fact that he did have some form of language, which raises the question, be you a plasticine man like Morph, a gifted language learner like Arsene Wenger and Kristin Scott Thomas, or indeed any of us, how did we learn our first language, and how do we perhaps continue to learn our second languages? Well, in an extremely broad terms, I think it's fair to say that language goes in and usually language comes out the other side. It's what happens in between that remains the mystery. And of course, this has become, in terms of SLA, Second Language Acquisition Studies, a really fiercely debated area. As you can see on screen, there are a number of broad schools of thought in terms of how languages are learned. And what we're going to be talking about today, noticing, falls into the middle column in the image on the left-hand side of cognitivism. Now, I wanted to show you this picture. This is a book I bought recently. Notice the title, Second Language Acquisition, an Introductory Course. Now, this is a very hefty book. It's huge, and necessarily so, because within the study of SLA, there is huge amounts of debate, counter debate, and it would be absolutely impossible to cover even noticing in all of its depth in the next 35 or so minutes. So please forgive me if some of the things I say are simplifications, but I hope that they will be enough to give you a flavor of what noticing is and how we can make use of it in our learners' language development. So, like noticing is really linked to the work of Richard Scmidt, and in 1990, but with later amendments, fitting in within that broad school of cognitivism, Scmidt suggested that it wasn't just, and here's our friend Morph again, with lots of input, but in fact, there was a subsection of input that had been closely attended to, that was processed, which became intake. And in Schmidt's view, the intake, the attended to input, everything else effectively is just noise that went in, enabled output to come out later on. It wouldn't necessarily be identical because, of course, there is I think, quite common agreement that each individual language learner has their own particular system of interlanguage, that is the mediation between the native speaker form and the form that the learner has, which is on a cline, and the better you get at the language, the closer you come to the native level competence. But importantly for Scmidt, it was intake that matters. So input is everything that is around the learner, things that they hear, things that they receive through reading, through writing, but not everything is necessarily useful and not everything is necessarily attended to. So as I mentioned previously, if we look at intake, this is that part of the language input that actually goes in. And many theorists working within cognitivism have suggested that what differentiates input and intake is that intake is attended to, it's noticed, and that it is processed in order to become output. So let's look a little bit more at what noticing really is and what it entails. So really what I'd like to do here is pause in order to find out from all of you how comfortable you are with noticing as a term. So we're going to run a little poll, and there are 3 questions here, and I'd like you to decide, broadly speaking, which group you feel that you link to most. Is it number 1, that noticing is a term within ELT that is pretty much new to you? You're not familiar with it. You couldn't really explain it to a colleague. Or is it 2, something that you're familiar with, but you'd like to know more about? Or is it 3, something that you're really confident with and you feel that you make informed use of it in your classes? So I'll just give you a few moments to register who you feel, or which group rather you feel that you associate with most. Okay, so I thought it was really interesting, and if you're familiar with the ELT Teacher to Writer series, you'll know how high quality their publications are. that in this lexicon for ELT professionals, noticing simply doesn't appear. And I think one of the reasons for this is that noticing, certainly in the UK, and SLA, second language acquisition studies generally, aren't particularly clearly parts of teacher development programs, and certainly not part of pre-service training like the CELT or the TEFL. Second language acquisition probably comes in at the higher level at Delta, but I suspect possibly in different countries this is different. And it does rather raise the question, to what extent should second language acquisition be a part of a teacher's professional development, and at what stage? Too big a question, I think, to discuss during this masterclass recording right here, right now, but an interesting point nevertheless. So I thought, for the benefit of those of you who are perhaps less familiar, we've talked about what noticing is and how it works, but I also wanted to provide you with something to kind of hang that understanding onto. So a nice quotation here from the British Council, which states that when learners notice new language, they pay special attention to its form, use, and meaning. And I think the term special attention is important here. That's what differentiates input and intake. Jack Richards talked about it being the conscious awareness of an aspect of the language input. So again, there is some kind of mental processing taking place. I think that's what he means by conscious awareness. So the question is, well, okay, fair enough. There's this thing called noticing. It's part of the cognitivist approach or way of thinking about second language acquisition. But so what? How does that make an importance for our learners? Well, I think the point here, and I'm here quoting S is for SLA in Scott Thornberry's blog online in A to Z of ELT. And here I've chosen some of the key points that I wanted to raise with you. That exposure to input is necessary, but there must also be opportunities for output. So things need to go in. Noticing would argue it's intake, but things need to come out as well. More of that in a moment. That language learners benefit from noticing salient features of the input. And I think the point here is that they're working with those aspects of the language which are noticeable and more readily noticeable. And that's, I think, where teachers come in. And that Scmidt went on to say, those who notice most learn most. And it may be that those who notice most are those who pay attention most. So there seems to be an argument that if you believe that noticing is an important part of language acquisition and our learners' language development, that, noticing is going to pay off. And therefore, perhaps as teachers, we need to help them to do this. Therefore, in summary, there is an importance of there being a kind of mental processing going on of what has been noticed, and that this is important before input becomes intake, and the language therefore moves into more long-term memory. And again, more of that in a few moments in terms of what we as teachers can do. Now, interestingly, as is always the case, I think, in academia, arguments and counter-arguments, Scmidt has somewhat adapted his beliefs. And I think it's now considered that noticing is beneficial rather than being essential for language acquisition to take place. So here are some of the factors that Scmidt considered important when he was writing about noticing in 1990. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I think that's something we can leave for the live discussion. But what I did want to make clear is this point in 1998 where Truscott, who actually wrote a fairly, I don't want to use the word damning, but certainly very incisive critical review of noticing, which led to a more wide-scale, weaker view of noticing in that it helps with the acquisition of metalinguistic knowledge. but not necessarily the development of communicative competence. Therefore, Truscott is arguing that if we work with noticing, it helps our students to be able to talk about the language and to be able to explain it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they become competent in using a particular language point confidently and competently. And therefore, as teachers, we need to help them with that process separately. Now, I've heard me talk a lot so far about what goes in. Think back to Morph and the input that was coming in. But what about the output? And this is where the other point of noticing comes in, the so-called idea of noticing the gap. And this is Merrill Swain's output hypothesis of 1995. And what she suggested was that in our learners, and I quote, being pushed to produce oral discourse, this can trigger within them a process by which the learner realizes that what they can say and what more experienced speakers and native speakers are able to do is different. Therefore, if learners attend not just to what goes in, but what comes out, what they can say, what they can't say, and what they realize they're saying but isn't quite as slick as someone who has a higher language level than them, then the output itself enables the learner to, and I'm quoting from the bottom of the slide here, identify their own mistakes, reassess their assumptions about the Tangan language, and edit their statements, which I think then has an importance for when we think about language reformulation. So where noticing started off as being about input, Swain moved it on to also talking about output as well. So knowing that one of the real values of these sessions is looking at what we can do with our students in the classroom, what I wanted to do in the rest of this presentation is to share with you some ideas for how we can make noticing as impactful as possible in the classroom. You'll notice that here I've put in brackets the end mostly adults, and there is a good reason for this. It's not the case that younger learners cannot analyze, but necessarily their analytical skills aren't as well developed as they are in adults. And therefore, many of the analytical approaches that we may take in the classroom are perhaps best used with adults or used to best effect with adults rather than with our young learners. So I wanted to begin in this slide by looking at some of the kind of the overarching issues in terms of noticing activities in our classroom. But note that in this section, I begin by looking at things that teachers do, but then I open it out to look at the kind of things that we can develop in our students so they can become more independent and notice for themselves. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these maxims, if you like, or Neil's maxims for noticing in the classroom. Well, the first one is, I think, receptive skills, as we used to call them, reading and listening, provide wonderful opportunities for access to language. So if you are someone who uses reading passages or listening transcripts for language work after the students have worked on developing their reading skills or their listening skills and their sub-skills, then I think it's really helpful to use a text as a way of encouraging students to notice. And the reason is not only are texts both authentic and semi-authentic, rich in noticeable language, but also, and I think really importantly here, unlike short sentences, they provide very rich contextual information about the language that is being looked at. Too often we decontextualize the language that we're working with, And if we're working with an individual sentence, we may miss clues about, for example, its register, the socio-cultural context with which it is meant to work. So I would always encourage you to be working with whole texts. They don't have to be very long, but whole texts all the same. I think it's also important to consider cognitive overload. Now, some people argue that you should always work with meaning first, then form, then pronunciation. Other people suggest that if you've got students who are very familiar with the form, but here you're looking at a different meaning of the target language. So, for example, if you're working with higher intermediate students, looking at the use of the present simple, you might kind of almost gloss over form and the occurrence of the third person S, but really be looking at how, when you're looking for timetable futures, the present simple is used, and really focus there on meaning. But nevertheless, a lot of people are arguing that in order to enable noticing, that we shouldn't overload the students' minds, that if we're asking them to process too many things simultaneously, it doesn't go in as well. And therefore, we should split up meaning, form, and pronunciation into different stages. And this is something that course books, I think, generally do quite well for us. Task demand. All too often, I think we ask our students to do a free practice activity if we're working with PPP, that simply the students avoid the target language. So in terms of working certainly with output, but also giving the students the opportunity to start automatizing their use of the target form, just make sure that the activity that you are doing organically provides meaningful opportunities and real use of the target form. In other words, avoiding the students just not using it at all. I think also, and we've seen this, haven't we, in previous gallery teachers, masterclasses, the importance of multiple opportunities for intake. Course books are notoriously bad at providing repeat opportunities for use of both new vocabulary and also grammar. It's the commodification, as Scott Thornbury talked about it, of grammar, the nuggets of language, particularly grammar forms. We need to provide our students with multiple opportunities to use and reuse the target language that we're working on. And, you know, if this is something you're interested in, I'd very definitely recommend you to have a look at the recent Gallery Teachers Masterclass on spaced repetition to find out more about how you can do this. And then finally, another way of getting students to be consciously aware of what it is that they've been working on is to actually just say to them, and I now do this at the end of every class that I teach, what did you learn today? What were the 3 most important things that you want to remember from today's lesson? How are you going about remembering them? And this gives them an opportunity to go, ah, yes, today's lesson was on, it might be the past simple. Past simple in English for regular verbs is formed with adding D to the end or ED, and it's got 3 different types of pronunciation. And just getting them to articulate that helps to make it more sticky and helps to kind of move the language into the interlanguage system that the student works with individually. Okay, so teacher-directed noticing activities, and there are a couple of points I wanted to start with here. The first one is the value of overt metalinguistic explanation. Now, I think grammar discovery, inductive learning is increasingly the norm, I think, in communicative language course books, certainly the ones I see published here in the UK and for Europe. But what's interesting is that there is very little evidence base for inductive learning being more successful than good old-fashioned deductive learning. I'm not arguing here for a return to chalk and talk, with teacher taking center stage in the classroom, but sometimes I think it is useful to have a nice balance between inductive and deductive. And if the teacher feels that there is value in using L1 as well as L2, and if this is going to help the students in their understanding of the meaning or the form, then why not? Something else that people are working with at the moment is this idea of text enhancement. We're going to see some examples over the next couple of slides. But it might be that you want to provide the students with a copy of a listening transcript where the particular form that you're working with is marked in a different color. It might be in a box, or it might be highlighted in a pen. And this is one way that you can show the students the target form and make it more visible, or indeed you can ask the students to do the same. Whether you're inductive or deductive, whether you're using guided discovery tasks, or you're teaching the point explicitly yourself, and then taking the students through gap fills, for example, what we do need to do is allow for an opportunity for personalization, actually using the target language in a way that is real for the learner. And then finally, in terms, and we talked about this again previously, the important that the task that we give the students where they personalize the language, where they activate the language, actually focuses on the target form that we're working with, rather than giving them opportunities to completely avoid it. So here are some examples of some grammar activities where noticing can take place. And the first one, I'm actually going to show you the end product. Just wonder if any of you can work out from this what the activity actually is. So a few seconds that you can jot some ideas down in the chat box. What kind of activity do you think is exemplified in this picture? If you thought it was a kind of dictation activity, or more specifically, a dictogloss activity, then yes, because dictoglosses are a fantastic way of helping students to notice the gap in terms of what they can or what they cannot do with the language, and then start to work towards being able to do it. If you're not familiar with the dictogloss, the teacher dictates at normal speed a short whole text, which is read aloud, as I say, at normal speed. And the point about the text is that it exemplifies multiple examples of the target language. The students then work together to reconstitute what they've heard in their own language. And then you reread it and they modify it, and that's, I think, what's happening with the different colors. And then you read it a third time, typically, and the students can modify again. You then provide the students with the original text that you had read, plus some questions which guide the students to think about the particular language form that you're wanting to focus on in that particular class. Okay. I talked about text enhancement. And here's an example of the use of color. So in this text, it's all the prepositions that are highlighted. It could be pronouns, it could be determiners, modal auxiliaries. It's really up to you to decide. And again, it's also for you to decide, do you ask the students to highlight, underline, circle, put in a box the examples of the target form that you ask them to look for, or do you provide it for them in a more deductive approach? So what's happening here is that the text, as it says at the bottom, it's almost impossible to ignore them when they're highlighted in red. I've just put one in this paragraph here, not all of them, just to make the point about how visible the target language becomes when we use another color. That particular example comes from the ELT notebook, and I'll be sharing my resources at the end of the session. So if the previous slide identified teachers having highlighted or changed the color for their learners, then of course another approach is that you give the students a text which hasn't been text enhanced, and you ask them to highlight the salient form. So can I just ask you, and I'll give you a few seconds to read this passage. It's a whole text on screen, and decide what language forms does the text exemplify that you could ask the students to look for? And I think there's more than one. Let me give you a few moments to read the passage. Okay, so it might be that you've picked up on the use of the present simple. I like to eat pizza every day. I eat it every day. I order, I love, and so on. Not every verb here is a present simple. I think that's useful to have a bit of contrast. But some of you might have also identified adverbs of frequency, typically, usually, often, but perhaps also the food-related vocabulary, all of which are appropriate for a noticing activity where the students underline, highlight, whatever it is you want them to do with the text. What else can we do with grammar? Well, I think as work with L1 and L2 instead of just L2 is becoming increasingly popular, we can work with the two language forms. So we might contrast the Italian form of the passato prossimo, ieri abbiamo giocato, with the English past simple, yesterday we played, and ask learners, well, how is the passato prossimo formed in Italian? And this is where, if you're having learners who have already learnt one second language, now learning their third. So, for example, if you're a teacher of Italian in the UK, if your students have already studied French, and if they're good language learners, you might also introduce the passé composé into the class so that they can realize that French and Italian in this respect are similar, and English is the one that has the ED morpheme change. Also useful is transferring, where we can make students aware that some features from L1 into L2 are different. And by simply saying to a student, how do you articulate don't in Spanish, no? And how do we do it in English? Well, we have do not. Are they same or different? They're different. English has a t at the end. This might be enough to, for some learners, make them aware that I can't say in English, I no like the meat, but actually they need to have a different grammatical structure. It won't work for everyone. Again, we need these multiple opportunities to revisit this. But I think by noticing, drawing attention to, requiring students to process it, that it really can help with moving that language into long-term memory. I've talked a lot about grammar. Let's talk now quickly about vocabulary. And of course, if we're working with collocation, and Lewis, in his lexical approach, really made a lot of the importance of noticing, then here, if we look at some collocations coming up on screen now, I think what we're going to see is how we can, or we owe it to our learners, not just to be using the individual word a party, but to throw a party at higher levels, a square meal, a blue steak, because this is what they're going to encounter, particularly if they come to countries where English is the L1. So I think for all of these, plentiful exposure in class, and at the most basic level, asking the students to underline words that go together, working from the keyword to the left, so adjective pre-modifying a noun, or working to the right as well, but also working with dictionaries, and if you have access to them, working with corpora can be a really helpful and powerful way of enabling students noticing. What else can we do with vocabulary? Well, We might want to work with false friends, some examples coming up here. Bookshop, library. Estoy embarazada, am I embarrassed or am I pregnant? As some examples. But also, I think where you're working with high-level learners, you might want to ask them, well, what's happening here? And this is something we see in proficiency in the use of English exam. Cows live in a blank. I work in the blank of education. And the word that we're looking at is field. And what we're doing, again, if we're working with translation and translanguaging, is we're making our students aware whether in their L1 the same word is used in both instances, or whether in fact different words are used to render this idea of field. The point I'm making here in terms of level, you can modify the activity. You might provide the word field and say, well, are these the same? Or you might ask the students to work out what the missing word is. The latter, I think, obviously works better at higher levels. But also, here, the key broke in the lock. The key problem was, again, another way of working with multiple meanings of the same form. To conclude, let's quickly look at some activities that students can do. And you might be wondering what this picture is doing here. This is, of course, the Rosetta Stone. And what I'm looking at here is an idea about archaeology and the metaphor of our students as language archaeologists. In the same way as the Rosetta Stone was dug up, can our students dig up language for themselves? Because, of course, the more independent the learner is, and the more independent they are in terms of their noticing, if we believe what we read earlier from Scmidt, the likelihood is the better language learner they're going to become. So I think it's useful to prime students, and particularly if they're working in a UK, America, an L1 environment, to collect authentic examples of the language. So it might be go out and see what examples of obligation language you can find. And the students might come back into classes with bicycles must not be left, no parking, no smoking, it's against the law to, please do not. Likewise, if we're working with noticing, another thing we can do is a categorization task. So, if we accept that the language of course books is essentially quite ritualistic and the authentic language can be quite different, what we have here on the left is some language of opinion, but which moves away from the language of, I agree with you, absolutely, I'm of the opinion that, which actually aren't that common. The ones we're seeing on screen are. So if we provide students with an example of a functional exponent, so for expressing agreement, I agree with you, and then ask them to look for other examples of agreeing language, and then to actually categorize it based on how we authentically agree, then this is another way of getting them to really attend and process the language to a very deep level. I would add here, whatever we're working with, grammar or vocabulary, we should also consider what our students are going to do with that language. How do they record it? Notebooks, flashcards, in an app? And how are they going to retrieve it? And how frequently are they going to retrieve it? We're back to that point about spaced repetition. A few more noticing activities with which to conclude. If they're again in an L2 environment, ask them to bring into class examples of authentic language as they encounter it. And then you could have a kind of a Friday morning, occasional, once a month language swap. Teacher, I found this. What's going on? What does this mean? How is it used? Another option, students share their finds with each other. And rather than the teacher being the font of knowledge, they actually work in groups to research meaning, form, pronunciation, and register of the language themselves. Because the more able they are to do the research, the more able they are to be independent and do this for themselves when they encounter new language later on. And then finally, I think very similar to Lewis's ideas about learner noticing and observing, all of these ideas really focus on the students attending to language that's around them. And that's the great thing, isn't it, about the internet and streaming. Wherever you are in the world, authentic language is much more readily available than it was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. That even if you are in an L2 environment, if you're in an L1 environment, my apologies, you still have greater access than ever before to language which can be noticed. So to conclude, noticing is only one small part of the language learning mystery, but I think is one that is very visible in our coursebook materials. Noticing originally was linked to input and intake particularly, but now is also associated with output. Noticing activities can be set up by us as teachers in the classroom, but also it's our responsibility, I think, to help learners to develop, to learn for themselves ways of noticing that make them more independent. Here is a reading list of some of the articles and some of the books that I used when putting together this masterclass. This will also be available later on the site. If you enjoyed this session and if you'd like to find out more, I've referred to other workshops, like, for example, the one recently done by Anna Kucha on space repetition, then please have a look at the Gallery Teachers Masterclass Library, which is a wonderful resource for teachers all around the world. It is a good question. What is noticing? Noticing is one of the many views that second language acquisition researchers have about the mystery of language learning and what it takes for someone to become a proficient language learner and user of a particular language. Noticing itself is part of the cognitivist approach to second language acquisition. And it's all about the deep processing that our students do initially in the classroom, but hopefully as we make them independent learners, what they also do outside of the classroom to turn the language that's all around them into intake, meaningful language that they have processed, which then will at some point come out as output. Now, that output might not be absolutely the same as the intake that went in. That's part of their developing interlanguage. But noticing is really about helping our students to attend to the language that we think is important for their language development at a particular point in their learning, and enabling them to use that language in a way that is communicatively competent and successful. Well, it's my view that to go about creating effective noticing in our lessons, that the first thing that we as teachers need to do is have at least a basic understanding of what noticing actually is. So step one is to become a little bit familiar with the term noticing, to understand where it comes from, and then to look at ways in which we can incorporate it in our own teaching. And that's what this masterclass is all about. Ideally, at that point, we'll then be able to hand it over to our learners to make them more independent language learners by enabling them to notice language for themselves, to attend to it, to process it, and for it to then therefore become part of their language output.